Hey everybody, it's Jason Blah here, and we're here finally. It is the final part of the Monday Q&A. And some of you are probably tired of listening to me talk by now, and I'm tired of talking with a clogged up nose and a cold. So let's knock this out. Is it okay for your heels to leave the ground on the top portion of a push press? Also, is it normal and optimal to have a wider grip on behind the neck press than a normal overhead press? For your first question, yes, absolutely. And some people, because they generate so much power when they are exploding on the push press, that oftentimes their heels leave the ground and they go up onto the balls of their feet as they're driving through at the top. And it's considered a perfectly acceptable form variation of the lift. Because you have to remember, the push press is, while very heavily a delt and tricep builder, it is still a full body explosive movement. And so that's just showing that you've actually developed a certain degree of explosiveness on it if that ends up happening as a result of it. It's perfectly fine. As to your other question, I would say that's actually normal. The majority of people, their optimal leverages on a regular front press versus a behind the neck press is that they're usually going to be a little wider, which you just saw with me doing that. For me, I would say I'm about 2 inches narrower on my optimal leverages on my normal press to the front versus my behind the neck press. And you see there, my hands even come apart further. Just because of the structure of the shoulder girdle, I think it is normal for there to be 2, 4, 5 inches difference between your grip on the two. And particularly, obviously, meaning the behind the neck press being a little wider. And it's just to do with the structure of your shoulder. That's actually perfectly normal. All right, next question. If you have trained for a year and gained a lot of strength, but haven't gained any muscle because of not being in a surplus, blah, blah. Okay, I'm not going to read the rest of this one out. Let's just answer it. Okay, your first question is biologically impossible. So we don't even need to get to the rest of the scenario. Yes, you can gain some strength without gaining muscle mass, but there's a very finite amount of strength that you can gain without an accompanying amount of hypertrophy. That's why this myth of, oh, these bodybuilders are always bigger than powerlifters or strength athletes, that's not always true. You'd be surprised when you see them side by side. You're generally seeing bigger arms and delts on bodybuilders because of all the shit they shoot in them. Now, that aside, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to gain significant amounts of strength without gaining significant amounts of hypertrophy. It just doesn't work that way. And I would say your cutoff is probably, as a novice lifter, you could probably gain strength for about 4 to 6 weeks through neural adaptations and non-hypertrophy structural changes before you start gaining a lot of muscle with the strength. And in fact, you know that you're not gaining any more hypertrophy than when, after 6 weeks, after you start lifting weights, if you don't ever gain any more strength at all, you would be the person who probably isn't hypertrophying. But if you gain strength beyond that, almost all of that strength was a result of direct tissue hypertrophy. It just doesn't work otherwise. Neural adaptations and new neural adaptations to training are fairly short-lived to training stimulus. They're your first line of defense before your body will force itself to make longer-term structural changes, but it will start making them fairly quickly if you continue to subject it to heavier loads. So there's just no way that you gain large amounts of strength without large amounts of hypertrophy. You recompositioned, and if you don't realize, if you went from a 100-pound squat to a 275-pound squat in that time, you gained a lot of muscle mass. It's just that you might have a body image disorder and you don't realize that you gained 15 pounds of muscle. So there you have it. All right, last question of the week. For people running your 5x5, should the reps on the squats and deadlift be pause reps? I currently pause on the overhead press and the bench. I'm going to say, to answer this, I'm going to give you the general recommendations that I give for most people, because it actually is the same as what I recommend on my program. Now, obviously, the overhead press and the bench, I won't pause. No touch and go there. The deadlift, I want you to always reset, which means that bar needs to be, the weights need to be touching the ground for a full second, at least, before you pull again, and I want you to completely reset on every rep. So that is pause on the floor. However, what we call a traditional pause squat means you pause at the bottom. I don't want to see that. I want you to try to drop deep and come back up quickly and to learn to train a stretch reflex, because you're going to gain more muscle and more hypertrophy with a stretch reflex than you will with a pause squat at the bottom. Now, it is acceptable to pause at the top to regain your breath. If you need a second or two to regain your stance, to regain your breath, and all of that at the very top once you've locked out on the squat, go ahead and do so. That is within the confines of the program, but don't pause at the bottom and don't take 5 and 6 second breaks at the top. If you're having to do that, it's time to reset the weight. But 1 to 2 seconds waiting at the top to regain your breath, perfectly acceptable. And again, to make sure that your stance and your setup is okay. So hopefully that clarified that. And I would recommend that for just general hypertrophy and general strength training. That is what I would recommend on all of those 4 lifts, is the way I broke that down. So overhead press and bench, you pause at the bottom for just a 1 count on every rep. The deadlift, I want you on the floor for at least a second before you pull again. And the squat, you're free to pause at the top for 1 to 2 seconds to regain your breath and reset your setup. But the bottom, you should come out of the bottom as hard and fast as possible. So you drop and then almost bounce off your glutes back up while still driving through the heels. All right, guys, so that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time. But let me give you guys a bicep shot before I go.